Pokrovsk basically has fallen. It's at least, 95% under Russian control. Minnigrad is just completely cut off. Now, some people split hairs and say, well, there's 200 meters or maybe 500 meters of open field that is not under Russian control that they could pass through. But they can't pass through it. It's a kill zone. I mean, look, 500 meters and you control both sides of it. Nothing is going to pass through. Before, just a few days ago, it was maybe 2 kilometers. And even that was basically an encirclement. But 2 kilometers of open field, maybe at night, a few guys might make it through, right? But still very, very unlikely. Now it's impossible. They're cut off. It's encircled. And so it's just a band of desperate men in Minnigrad. They still, I think they're hanging on to about half of the city. They have some high rises, which are easy to defend, but the Russians have seized other high rises within Minnigrad. And they, it's just the clock is ticking. Because they're cut off, they can't escape, but neither can they receive supplies. They might get some, via drone, but that's just not going to be anywhere close to sufficient. It's over. And they should surrender. Some of them are. There is footage coming out of surrenders. We just don't know how many. We don't even know really how many are in there. Some people say thousands. Other people say hundreds. I don't know how many remain in there. But that's, I guess that's what everybody's looking at, the fall of Minnigrad. Now, that's important. There's no question about it, that when it falls, when you look to the west of Pokrovsk, you see country, you see just open country. You're actually getting out of the Donbass. You're getting into Dnipropetrovsk, which is a very different kind of country and is more difficult to defend. Some people have argued, well, it's open and, that gives an advantage to the drones. But it's not completely open. There are small villages. There are tree lines, the occasional small woods. And it's that kind of country that you find farther south, and which the Russians are moving through right now, right there pretty much at the boundary line between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye. I think I've said recently that they have started, the Russians are taking, when you add up all the advances up and down the line, they have been progressing faster than they did at any time since 2022. And the bulk of actually those advances are down there in that area to the south of Pokrovsk, again, Dnipropetrovsk in the very northern part of Zaporozhye. And the country that you find there is the country that you find to the west of Pokrovsk now. So when this falls, if they want to, who knows what the Russians will do, they'll probably go off in different directions. They can go north and go towards Kramatorsk and Slavyanka. This will just be there. As they take all these cities, they'll be, the different armies are going to be on different routes heading towards those two cities, from the north, from the south, from the east. Or they can head kind of northeast to Konstantinovka, which is already partially under Russian control, and just complete that battle up there. But they can head west, through this country, and they could expand rapidly and make it all the way to the Dnieper, and maybe they'll do all those things.
We've seen multiple Ukrainian cities fall to the Russians, and it seems like every time one is encircled, about to fall, there's a lot of talk about how this could be a collapse or the end, and it never happens. And we've had, all the way from Bakhmut, well, I guess we wouldn't say Bakhmut, but Avdiivka, Ugledar, cities like these. Is what's happening now, do you think it's really different than when these other cities fell? Or is it more or less, should we see kind of a similar pattern where it was strategic, but it's going to go on for a long time?
I don't think it's going to go on for a long time, but it could go on for a while. Again, let's be honest, all of us have been surprised by the staying power of the Ukrainian army. And many of us, I think we have to admit, expected it to collapse maybe even a year ago. And it hasn't happened. That doesn't mean that it won't. It will happen. It is like a question of math, as Daniel Davis, the military commander, says, because the Russian army is just getting larger. Month by month, it is actually increasing in size, and it's not, and it's a very well armed army. You know, the all the military equipment continues to roll off the production lines, and they have actually great reserves of both men and of military equipment. On the Ukrainian side, they are becoming increasingly threadbare. I think we mentioned last time that there was a desertion rate of something like 20,000 a month, and it's just barely, it's maybe only a little less. It's not even clear that it is less than the number of men that they're able to forcibly conscript in a month. And then they're suffering very serious casualties. You have to see that. That's what's happening in Pokrovsk, for example, but in many places up and down the line. So this is a shrinking army. It's a weakening army. We can see it. I remember in the first couple of years, especially like in the first couple of years of the war, I remember looking at maps and you could see all the reserve units, set in the rear, and there were many of them. And what was happening is, okay, the Russians were chewing up these frontline units, but when they finally chewed one up to the point where it was no longer combat capable, they just had a number of reserve units to move in and replace it and plug the hole. And so, basically the line just didn't move. That's what was happening. But now they're just not there. They just have so few. Again, that I think they had. This is again according to Daniel Davis. They had one strategic reserve, and that was when remember the breakout that was just north of Pokrovsk that happened in August, where all of a sudden the Russians just went 10, 20 kilometers to the north and seized a big piece of land. That really caused panic among the Ukrainians, because they thought that this might be the beginning of the collapse. Because like if the Russians just keep on going, they can get so deep in our rear that we don't even have our drones set up, and then we're screwed. So they had this one strategic elite reserve. I think they were Azov guys that were sent there and to fight them. And they've had some success. They stopped it basically, and they've launched a series of counterattacks, but then they don't even have any. They didn't have anything similar to actually direct against to reinforce Pokrovsk or these other areas. They just don't have them. So these cities are falling. These are all very important fortifications, part of their line of fortifications, the Ukrainian line of fortifications, but they don't have the units. They just don't have those reserves to move around. They're forced to, if they're going to reinforce Pokrovsk, they could see that it was falling, but what could they do? Because that would just mean that Kupiansk would fall more quickly, or Konstantinivka, or Seversk, or Liman. That just looking at that situation, you'd have to say, well, I don't know that the collapse is around the corner, but it looks pretty close to me. It doesn't seem that far away. And I think, again, the only reason that it hasn't happened is the role of drones. Now, that drones play in this war, which is going to be, I think, the future of warfare, for the foreseeable future. You can have one guy, one drone operator, that is equal to 100 men. And it takes a while. The Russians will eventually find them and take them out, but that is a painstaking process. It takes a while. These guys can be deep underground. They can be very well hidden. But even the drone operators are going. They're being hunted down. They're suffering attrition like all the others. And so there's some point when there's just going to be a big gap in the line, and there's going to be an empty hole, and the Russians will blow through the way that they blew through, to the north of Pokrovsk back in August. But there just won't be a unit to confront them, and they'll just keep on going.
When we have a collapse, I think a lot of people think that if there's a collapse, and then that means we'll be getting to the end of the war. But I'm afraid that a collapse will mean the entry of NATO. Do you believe that's a valid fear?
It's a valid fear. There's no question about it. NATO just doesn't. Well, if you look at the European part of NATO, they don't really have the troops. Again, like they're talking about numbers of sending 2,000 of British, 2,000 French, something like this, and these are ridiculously small numbers. In this war, the 2,000 men are killed often in just within less than a week. I think that's actually pretty typical. That's not at all unusual, or at least put out of action easily within a week. So, that what are you talking about? If the French and the British send these to fight, that's just 2 extra weeks for the Ukrainians. And I think they probably would fare very poorly. These Ukrainians, they've been fighting this war. They understand how this war is fought. And it's a very different war than the kind of war that NATO troops have been trained for. So, they could not change the tide of the war. The danger, of course, is that, and I think this is actually the point of sending those troops, they're not really intended to turn the tide of battle. They're tripwire troops, right. And they're supposed to bring in the U.S. And the U.S. does have, a substantial military. Again, we've talked about its weakness, but it is a substantial military and a very substantial air force. And of course, the danger is if that the U.S. comes in, then, and if the U.S. gets, well, either way you look at it, it's bad. Let's say if they're very successful and they push the Russians back and they threaten Moscow, then we're looking at the danger of nuclear war. But if they're just absolutely wiped, out by the Russians and humiliated, especially when you think about the president that we have, I think we're again in danger of a nuclear war. So that's the thing, I think that's a real danger of a NATO intervention, is that it will bring in the U.S. And then there is, there's no certainty. It doesn't mean that it has to happen, but we would be on an escalatory ladder leading us to nuclear war.
Right. So what you paint is a lose-lose scenario. So why do so many politicians want to push for that? Like, if you beat Russia, nuclear war. And if the U.S. is in and Russia starts to beat the United States, nuclear war, right? So right. Why are we even doing this? I thought we figured this out. We understood what mutually assured destruction was. Right. So why is this happening
right.
now?
Well, exactly. That's something that we did understand through the Cold War, especially during the last couple of decades of the Cold War. We understood that very well. And so said, these plans, if anybody came up with plans to take Moscow or whatever, they were ridiculed. They were lampooned because it was just so self-evidently insane to push something like that. Okay, so you just want to end the planet. That's what you're pushing for. But we hear that language. We hear it from various politicians, and certainly like people like Kaja Kallas, right? Okay. Who is not just a minor politician, but who is the foreign policy chief for the EU. Talking about actually, defeating Russia, breaking apart Russia. This kind of language is out there. So it's we've discussed this. It's just really hard to explain how this has happened, but we can just say that in general, the leadership, again, I've made the argument. It's just like they were kind of during the unipolar moment, they developed a sense of supremacy, and with supremacy, I think, comes a loss of grip on reality. You have a sense, you lose your healthy sense of vulnerability. Let's put it that way. And you just come to think that there really aren't any consequences for whatever you want to do. That's part of being a hegemon, and they don't understand that they are no longer a hegemon. I mean, it would have even been crazy to do back in the 1990s because the Russians did have all these nuclear weapons. They still had them. But it's just for whatever reason, we have leaders in the West who just don't seem to fully appreciate the dangers. And then we have a leader in the U.S. who seems to be extremely volatile, let's say. Again, we've talked about, the importance on the part of the Russians of establishing deterrence. And Putin has been criticized for not doing that. But I think again, as I said earlier, that Putin understands Trump's psychology. And that's one reason why he's not willing to, openly threaten him in any way. Just think about what's, some of the things that have happened over the last few months. It was maybe just a couple of months ago that Medvedev tweeted something that really got under the skin of, I think frankly, Trump misread it. I mean, he wasn't Medvedev wasn't
It was
really
basically what we
saber-like.
were saying. Saying, be careful, we have nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
want to have
it's
a
just
war
like
with
sober
us.
up. Let's not go down this path. Okay, right? Exactly. But that got under his skin, raised Trump's hackles, and then he made that statement about sending the nuclear submarine. I've instructed him to go right off the coast of Russia or something, which a lot of people pointed out really didn't mean anything or didn't make much sense. But it just shows that this was his response. And then, just a week or so ago, we had that test of the Burevestnik. And how did Trump, and then followed by the test of the Poseidon. How did Trump respond to that? He actually, went out, said, well, you're going to have to start nuclear testing. And it's not clear what he really means by that. But again, it shows, if he actually does go ahead with it, again, the Trump administration just hasn't made it clear what his real intention is there. But just the ambiguity there is very scary. Again, you see this kind of reaction. I think it's, this extreme volatility on his part. And I think it's one thing he just doesn't, he's very much invested in this image of the hegemon. Maybe he wants to be at least the first among equals. He has to be number one. And when the Russians came out with these new weapon systems which the Americans don't have or are not even close to having, that was for him, some kind of humiliation and an affront to, I think, his dignity as the president of what's supposed to be the absolutely, unquestioned most powerful country on earth. And so he reacted in this very dangerous way. And that's the thing that, I think you have to be worried about. You have these people, kind of the paper tigers in Europe. I don't think they're really all bark and no bite. They're not capable of really biting, but they're always pressuring the hegemon back in the U.S., to go up the escalation ladder. And yeah, sometimes he resists it, and he's shown a tendency, or at least at various points in the first several months of his term, to pursue a diplomatic route. But now he's back on that escalation ladder, and there's always been that other side of his personality, that just, if he can't get his deal, then he just wants to make it clear to everybody that he's top dog. And that can sometimes, be that can lead him into very dangerous territory.
Yeah, it's scary. He's so unstable. You could work on him and think that, he's starting to understand the position and the reality, and then he just completely flips and says, you know what, let's just start a war and let's nuke somebody. Like it could happen. And I heard there's been a lot of discussion in Russia about Trump's statements about nuclear testing and saying, okay, well, Trump said this. We can't just sit here in this ambiguity and assume that it was just him just mouthing off. It takes months to prepare for these types of tests. We can't let the Americans get a start on this, and they're going to start doing their nuclear testing. We just have to assume that what he's saying is true. And then my mind is like, okay, just Trump not understanding what's going on and just speaking off the cuff like that, he might just inadvertently start another nuclear arms race just from this.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think he really I know he didn't understand. I don't know exactly what he was saying, but he didn't understand the situation. It was clear. He said, now we have to have a nuclear test. I don't know if he thought that what they had done was a nuclear test. It wasn't a nuclear test. It was a test of, of a missile and basically a torpedo. That's what the Russians did. They weren't violating this nuclear test ban. But then when he's questioned, and I think I remember seeing him questioned by a journalist who began to press him on it. And then he became defensive and said, well, the Russians and Chinese are doing it. And he claimed to have kind of secret information that he knew that they had done this, that they had done, I guess, true nuclear tests. But of course, that's nonsense. And I know Alexander McCurry has pointed out, he was completely right. He said that if that, first of all, it's easy to detect. We have lots of ways of detecting everything from seismic detectors, to satellites. If a nuclear test is conducted, we would know instantly. And if it happened, we would, we would make it public and we would confront them. This is not something that we would keep secret. Why would you keep it secret? We're always looking for reasons to increase hysteria against the Russians and accuse them of all kinds of nefarious things. So it was just a total lie, I think, but it just shows again this character. He doesn't like to be challenged. He doesn't like to admit errors, and he could just keep on going forward with a very, very dangerous policy.
Right. Yeah, I'm concerned about how this Ukraine war is going to end. It's part of me. Before, I used to just think when the collapse is going to happen, it's just the war is over, and the West is going to have to admit defeat. We don't have the resources, and we've both been surprised about the inability of the Western MIC to scale up its production. But I saw something in RT the other day, and I don't know how true this is. It said that Mark Rutte was saying that NATO is now outproducing Russia in munitions. And it was a year ago that we were saying that there was an admission from Mark Rutte that actually Russia was outproducing NATO 4-1. So I don't know if it was a specific category, not all munitions. I misspoke.
Right. Yeah.
But
well, he actually did not say munitions. I saw that interview. He said ammunition. So, munitions will include ammunition, but also, the various other kinds of military equipment. Munitions is a much more expansive category. So ammunition, it's not clear. Is he talking about just
bullets?
Yeah, right. Bullets, small arms rounds, or shells, artillery shells. It's not clear. And it wasn't even a year ago. I think it was just a few months ago. He said it more than once that Russia was outproducing NATO, 4-1. So I don't know. I don't know if there's any basis for that. Maybe it's true within some specific category of ammunition. It's very unclear.
Right.
But you do have to say, as time goes on, maybe eventually they'll get their act together. I kind of thought that they would have had their act together a couple of years ago. And it just amazes me that here we are, we're approaching the fourth year and they still haven't got their act together. But, we make fun of them, but they are, we're talking about, the EU is 400 million people. And it's, when you look at it as a single country, it's one of the, easily the largest economies in the world. And there is at least a latent capability, theoretical ability to actually to begin to achieve what Mark Rutte was claiming.
Right, exactly. That's where I was going to go with this. That's my fear, is that we've always kind of poo-pooed the ability of the West to manufacture arms, and it's valid. We have not seen the ability to scale up in so many different areas. But as time goes on, you put enough money at it, eventually maybe something starts to gain traction, and then the MIC engine starts to rev up. And then once it begins to rev up, it begins to lend confidence to the West and their ability, we can actually win this. We got some momentum behind us in certain categories. And then we're in big trouble. So that's what I'm afraid of, is that they might be able to convince enough people that we are more powerful than we really are. And we might slowly be getting more powerful. And then that will lend to this, inevitable clash between NATO and Russia. How are you feeling about that?
Well, that's a worry. I don't see any evidence of that. We have Mark Rutte's claim, but when you look at it, well, first of all, Europe doesn't really have the infrastructure. Part of the problem with NATO is that it is an alliance of many different countries. And each of those countries has its own national interest. It has its own little MIC. And these little MICs, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of mirror the American MIC. They produce some good weapons, but I think it's, again, I think it's a consequence of all those decades of peace and prosperity. It's become a very comfortable arrangement where everything really is geared to, again, lining the pockets of certain people and producing things that look good at exhibitions, but are not really designed to win the kind of war that is being fought in Ukraine. So they have these really these, let's say, structural obstacles to doing this. And you can throw money at things, but if you have the whole structure that's set up, it is really not geared to producing what is needed, it won't make a difference. You have to reorganize, restructure. And I don't see that that's happened. I've heard, under Chancellor Merz in Germany, a lot of money is being thrown at their their MIC. So you have, oh yeah, what? How can I forget the name now? The big German defense concern. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There was some reports. They're receiving a lot of money and they're developing these new weapons, but already there are reports of incredible overspending, the kind of things that we always hear about from the Pentagon. They're loving it, but it sounds like it's the same old thing. It's just like, oh boy, we can get rich off of this, and actually the drones, for example, that they were trying to develop ended up doing very, very poorly. But yeah, they got $1 billion and everybody's very happy. So it kind of tells me that we're still a ways from that. But you're right. Maybe over time, it's not like it's absolutely, at least it's theoretically possible that, yeah, they could reorganize. Again, they do have a lot of people, there's a lot of scientific and technical talent. They could conceivably, become a powerhouse, but we just don't see it happening now. And maybe it'll never happen. It just seems like, again, that Europe is, and the U.S. to a great extent, are can't get out of this, again, these very comfortable arrangements that developed over the course of the latter part of the Cold War.
Right. I hope you're right, because that might be what saves us. Because, let me just ask you, do you believe that this will end in a conflict directly between NATO and Russia, or do you think that that's not that likely of an outcome? Because you would say before I didn't think that was going to happen, but I'm just not so sure anymore.
Right. I wish I could say that, yeah, I'm confident it won't. I still don't think so. I think we're going to avoid that. Again, I don't think it's going to be a very satisfying ending, as John Mearsheimer often says, it'll be an ugly victory. He says there's no question the Russians are going to win, but it'll be an ugly victory. And there will be this rump, angry Ukrainian state supported by the West that was going to continually trying to provoke Russia, and that it'll be just like a bleeding wound in the middle of Europe. But even so, that would be better than a direct war between the U.S. and Russia, and I think but this is just a sort of amount of faith that I have, which is very well maybe misplaced. Faith in the sanity of the American military leadership, that they understand, they can only go so far. And in the end, they don't want to see those missiles fly either. And they see a real risk of that. And they may also understand that they could be humiliated. It's just better to walk away and blame it on the Europeans than to say that, then let the world see that they have been actually whipped by the Russians. I think that they're going to walk away, but I just wouldn't be sure, because again, we're talking Donald Trump. Anybody who's just sure about what Donald Trump is going to do, I think is a fool. The guy is erratic, he's volatile, and okay, yeah, he can lurch one way, but then he can turn around and go the other 180 degrees in the other direction.